Mike Braun's healthcare proposals, Jennifer McCormick's economic development proposals, plus the cost of the child care shortage, and more. From the television studios at WFYI, it's Indiana Week in Review for the week ending September 27th, 2024.
Indiana Week in Review is made possible by the supporters of Indiana Public Broadcasting Stations.
This week, Republican gubernatorial candidate Mike Braun released a health care plan that would expand on past legislative action, including some policies that failed during the last few legislative sessions. Indiana Public Broadcasting's Abigail Ruman reports Braun's plan includes prior authorization reform, regulations for pharmacy benefits managers, and, among other things, a ban on non-compete clauses.
The plan positions prior authorization reform as a way to enhance transparency. While reform was a key part of the Senate GOP's policy priorities during the last legislative session, Republican lawmakers ultimately killed a reform bill due to fiscal concerns. The plan also proposes banning non-compete clauses for licensed medical personnel in not-for-profit hospitals, which builds on the Federal Trade Commission's rule that banned them in for-profit settings. The legislature did pass a ban on non-compete clauses in 2023, but only for primary care doctors. Braun also wants to regulate pharmacy benefits managers. Lawmakers passed a bill last session that added some transparency measures for the third-party administrators, but didn't add any regulations beyond audits.
Can Mike Braun push lawmakers to take bigger steps on health care? It's the first question for our Indiana Week in Review panel. Democrat Ann DeLaney, Republican Whitley Yates, John Schwantes, host of Indiana Lawmakers, and Niki Kelly, editor-in-chief of the Indiana Capital Chronicle. I'm Indiana Public Broadcasting State House Bureau Chief Brandon Smith. Ann DeLaney, can new leadership in the governor's office push the General Assembly to go further than it's gone?
No. Okay. First of all, I'm glad to see that he's agreeing with the with the Biden-Harris administration, because he's worried about the pharmaceutical benefit managers group. And the federal government's already filed suit against the three biggest ones of those. That's going to be resolved federally. The other thing that's going to be resolved federally, it seems to me, is the prior authorization. The idea that you could push the supermajority who hasn't wanted to touch this issue into going against Anthem, who's, a half mile down the street, or against Lilly, who's another half mile down the street, is not realistic. Some of these things are going to be resolved federally. I think he's right about the non-compete. The non-compete ought to apply to all doctors across the board, not just not-for-profit hospitals, but all hospitals, and stopping 18-year-olds from second-guessing a doctor's prescription in a prior authorization makes sense. But again, these are things I think that the federal government is going to deal with. I know our health care costs are high. Look at our population. We have a lot of diabetes. We have a lot of smokers. We have a lot of obesity. We have problems that we need to address fundamentally with our population if we're ever going to get those health costs into manageable positions.
And that is something Braun has talked about, too, is the shift towards prevention instead of just remediation, just treatment. The legislature has nibbled around the edges on some of this stuff. It's offered these bills. It hasn't really gone that far in any of these areas that Braun is highlighting, or in most of these areas Braun is highlighting. Can the governor, being a loud voice for these things, make a difference in the State House?
I absolutely think that they can and that they will. And you have to remember that he's been a proponent of health care prior to the Biden administration. He's been speaking about these things, and he has real life experience in managing the health care of his own small business. And so utilizing that real world experience, as well as his relationships with the legislature, as well as his experience specifically in Congress with federal legislation, I think makes for the perfect storm in getting stuff like this passed.
Yeah, I don't think he's going to carry very much weight with the legislature.
And you think Jennifer McCormick will?
Oh, I think that most of these are going to be resolved federally, as I said.
Which is where he is right now. Exactly.
We're going to control the legislature the next time around, and it'll get done.
John, do you think the governor and the bully pulpit that the governor will have, regardless of who's in the office, can push the General Assembly further than they've been willing to go?
He can push to a certain extent, but I don't think necessarily if leadership and the supermajorities, if in fact they remain supermajorities, and I guess we'll find out soon enough about that, don't want to embrace these for some of the reasons that have been mentioned, either the strength, the lobbying strength of an Anthem or the clout of an Eli Lilly, well, then I don't think he carries the day. I think there would be this quaint notion of compromise. There would be elements of his plan that probably would be embraced. Transparency generally seems to resonate with members of the General Assembly and with the public. We've seen attempts where you have estimates, versus actual quotes on costs. So how far do you go in that continuum? It strikes me that a lot of the things he's proposing, and they are certainly on the transparency front, things that he has advocated.
For a while.
And in fact, his Hospital Transparency Act Part 2.0, which he introduced in December, is bipartisan support, including Bernie Sanders, who is a co-sponsor. So he's shown an ability to work across the aisle on this issue. But whether that helps him, he doesn't have to work across the aisle on this issue. He has to work on his side of the aisle, which can be challenging.
Senate President Pro Tem Roderick Bray, speaking at an Indianapolis Business Journal healthcare panel this week, was talking about was asked about the high healthcare prices and pointed to this, this transparency portal that we talked about here on the show a few weeks ago. It's finally launched this year. And I think his message was kind of like, well, let's see what the data starts to tell us now that we finally can see this data and see, is this going to be another session of, let's see what the numbers tell us?
Gosh, I don't know, maybe. I mean, the fact is people are struggling. And so, they've worked around the transparency sides for a couple years now. And I think the fact that Mike Braun is coming in with a much bolder stance on these things is pretty impressive. A few smaller issues that are in that plan, which I thought are fascinating, are allowing the Attorney General to actually block mergers and acquisitions because, so much of our health care is monopolized at this point. And also there's a fascinating idea he had about trying to encourage more primary care facilities to be built by creating a revolving loan fund funded by the IEDC. They seem to have all the money in the world, so maybe they can help out there.
We also have to attract doctors. And when they take the positions they take on abortion and LGBT rights, all the doctors are telling us it's difficult to recruit new people to Indiana. So that's part of the problem.
We have one of the best we have one of the best med schools.
And they leave once they're educated. I agree, it's a great med school. But if they don't practice in Indiana, it's no good to them.
It is one of the largest, it's one of the biggest. And so we can, in Indiana, incentivize people to not only stay here, but to live here and to add to
quality of life makes a big difference for doctors.
There's one other provision that's kind of a sleeper in there that caught my attention, and that is having strict metrics for outcomes of different types of medicine, which the cynic would say, oh, weren't those like death panels where you can decide what medicine can be rendered? Or, in 65% of cases, the 85-year-old patient doesn't need this treatment because it's not going to work. Now, I'm not saying he's advocating that, but when you start talking about setting up metrics that predict outcomes, that suggests that somebody's not going to get the care that he or her and that person's family wants.
All right, time now for viewer feedback. Each week we pose an unscientific online poll question, and this week's question is, will the Indiana General Assembly take meaningful steps to reduce healthcare costs in 2025? A, yes, or B, no. Now, last week we asked you who will win Indiana's race for governor. We had a huge spike from our normal response rate. 66% say Republican Mike Braun, 29% say Democrat Jennifer McCormick, and 5% say Libertarian Donald Rainwater. If you'd like to take part in the poll, go to WFYI.org/IWIR and look for the poll. Well, Democratic gubernatorial candidate Jennifer McCormick says Indiana needs to refocus its economic development strategy. McCormick unveiled proposals this week that she says prioritize people and not just businesses. McCormick says state government has spent too much time focused on certain regions, creating pockets of success.
We still have 92 counties that we need to pay attention to.
McCormick's proposals include more local input into economic development strategies and better support for existing Indiana businesses, notably smaller ones. McCormick also wants to spend more on tourism and quality of place projects like affordable housing and cultural amenities. She says finding the money for that involves changes at the Indiana Economic Development Corporation.
The blank checkbook and the question of spending and the lack of transparency and accountability and the question of our natural resources. There are a lot of pieces to that we need to rein in.
McCormick also wants to reduce the length of time that new businesses receive tax breaks for locating in Indiana. Whitley, does Indiana's economic development strategy need a significant shift?
I think you have to look at the candidates. You've got one that's putting political platitudes on paper, and then you have Mike Braun, who's a Main Street entrepreneur.
I thought that's what his health care plan was, the platitudes on paper.
Absolutely not. He's produced that for his own businesses. Exactly. So you've got a Main Street entrepreneur who's going to be over economic development, who doesn't come from Central Indiana. So he's going to have a bottom-up approach when it comes to how he incorporates the rural counties as well as small businesses. He's someone that has signed the front of people's paychecks, and his ability to really understand that and leverage the way that he's able to produce jobs as well as increase wages is going to be seen not only through his private business but also through his gubernatorial leadership.
The way that Braun and McCormick talk about economic development is remarkably similar in a lot of ways, in expressing, I think, what we're hearing from voters, especially those who don't live in Indianapolis, which is we need to change the way we're doing this.
Right.
Is it going to change?
I think there is some momentum for that among rural areas in the state. And I think Jennifer McCormick's emphasis on small business is the way to go. You know, the top 5 economic development projects in this state, which are going to cost about $15 billion, okay, they're going to generate 1,500 jobs. 1,500 jobs. And what kind of stress are they going to put on our roads, on our water, on our electricity? All of those questions are there, and yet there's this huge amount. When people talk about Bitcoin, it produces almost no jobs, but uses a fantastic amount of water and electricity. Who's going to pay for that? I mean, we need to look, like Jennifer McCormick says, at small businesses and entrepreneurs on the local levels. I mean, some of the places we're locating things, like, for example, that whole Leaf District without the water, I mean, there are reasons that coal companies located along rivers because water was readily available. Boone County is not a source of that. And the idea that the IEDC would help develop these kinds of medical things, you know, some group that pays $100,000 an acre for a farm acre that's worth $12,500 is not my idea of the person who ought to be doing investments in anything else.
Some of this is also how the IEDC budget has worked these last couple of years. Now, part of it is because Indiana has been incredibly flush with cash in its last 2 budgets, largely because of federal dollars flowing into the state. So that was always going to change a little bit. But do you think there's going to be a fundamental shift in how that agency gets dollars and can use them?
Yeah, I definitely think, you know, the lawmakers are not going to give them the blank checks that they've given them for these large deal closing funds and performance grants and incentives that they did in the last budget. I think there's starting to be a little bit of pushback even among Republicans. I do find it fascinating that both Mike Braun and Jennifer McCormick want to focus on outside of Indianapolis and smaller businesses. The fact that IEDC is really caught up in the capital investment side, but not the number of jobs side, I think is starting to get noticed by a lot of people. And so, you know, I think it's great for Hoosiers that we're having those conversations now.
I can remember, just want to make one point, back when in other gubernatorial campaigns where the cost per job was put out there. Now, these aren't state funds, okay? But when you take that $15 million, you're talking about $10 million a job. A job.
The $1 billion.
Billion.
And then, so it's 15 billion to 10 million.
Thank you.
Billions,
Yeah, sooner or later it starts to add up to real money, as I believe the saying goes. A lot of focus and a lot of criticism of the IEDC has been focused particularly on the LEAP project. But the LEAP project is so kind of far down the line now. Is that probably going to stay roughly what it is in terms, well, obviously we hope we get more companies to locate there, but other than that, is that really going to change all that much, regardless of who's in the governor's office?
I think it's probably a done deal. And if you look at Jennifer McCormick's plan, it doesn't say abandon it, put a road closed sign on it and plant soybean.
And Mike Braun has said nothing like that either.
No, I mean, she's basically saying let's not move forward until these questions are answered, until we have questions about water and the environment and the impact and so forth. But I'm too, as you suggested early on, I'm struck by how close together the overarching aspects of these proposals are and how normal and traditional they are. I thought that there was much more disparity of opinion and rancor. That's I was going to say, vehemence about various views in the Republican primary race by far. Yeah. I never thought I would see a Republican primary in Indiana where it came down on, economic development, different, because that was one unifying factor for decades on the Republican side.
But I think this is from both of them reflective of the fact that this is what they're hearing from people.
I think it's what they're hearing, and now it's also they're not running in a primary. That's not as ideological. It can be more pragmatic, and it has to be a plan that appeals to, in theory, all Hoosiers.
All right, a new study this week from the Indiana Chamber of Commerce and Early Learning Indiana says the state is losing more than $4 billion with a B dollars a year in economic productivity and tax revenue because of a shortage of affordable childcare. In the study, 57% of parents of young children missed at least a day of work in a 3-month span because of childcare-related reasons. And 40% of parents who had those kinds of work disruptions in the last year said they left the workforce as a direct result of childcare-related issues. In a statement, Chamber of Commerce CEO Vanessa Green-Cinders says childcare access and affordability issues continue to hold back the Hoosier workforce and future economic growth. The organizations also point to studies that show childcare helps produce better outcomes, including higher test scores and less likelihood of dropping out. John Schwantes, we saw a report a few years ago that we talked about a lot on this show about the cost of a lack of mental health care. And that produced results at the General Assembly, an influx of spending in that area. Can this similar report, I mean, the dollar amount is almost exactly the same. Could this study produce similar investments from the General Assembly?
Well, 'tis the season for these studies. When you have a budget year, you have, hey, there's $1 billion gap in highway maintenance between what we, need to keep our growth, on track in terms of an economically robust state. This is when we see these types of plans. And those numbers do get lawmakers' attention when you can say, oh, you are losing X amount of money, or at the very best case scenario, you're squandering the opportunity to make this much more. This issue seems to me to be one that's obvious to a lot of people. If you look at the fact that their state right now, our capacity for child care is 61%. I mean, even if every seat where somehow there was some algorithm that says you're going there and,
made it all work,
you'd still be, essentially half of Hoosiers who need this help. And you also look at some of the statistics in the report where, for instance, the Federal Health and Human Services Administration says that, they recommend no more than 7% of a family's income be spent on child care in a given year. But you look at the average in Indiana, which is $8,000.
Right.
It doesn't do much math to say, let's see, if 7% is 8,000, that's not help. I mean, there are a lot of Hoosiers families who are not
close to that
and are suffering because of it. They too could make more money. Not only the state coffers, but a lot of Hoosiers certainly could feel that.
Well, it's something. I mean, as we think about the economies of the future, and we're always trying to grow to that. That's why we're redesigning high school and all that. If people people don't go into the workforce, I have to leave the workforce because they're trying to care for their kids. Is this the session where lawmakers have to take big leaps?
It's going to be hard for them not to. Right now, they've kind of worked around the side and talked about regulations and trying to free up the free market. But at some point, the areas that are making progress on this issue are putting direct subsidies in, either for parents or for providers or something to spur the growth in this area. And I think the Republicans in the state have obviously been concerned about that. But, this is, a report coming from conservative Indiana Chamber of Commerce saying, hey, we need these people to fill these jobs that we have that are empty. And so I think it'll definitely carry a little more weight into the session.
And I think importantly, it's not just, oh, we're missing out maybe on some dollars we could otherwise get. Right. It's we are losing. We are losing this money.
Right. We are.
How much, though, because I hear lawmakers talk about this, how much, though, does the private sector need to step up and go, okay, we're going to provide options too?
I think the private sector does have a responsibility, but I think the state does too. I mean, for example, preschool. If we made universal preschool available, it would be a huge step. If we had universal kindergarten available, it would be a huge step. I mean, those are 2 years or sometimes 3 years that parents wouldn't have to be paying for that. That's a huge gift to families making the median income in Indiana, which is well below what you're talking about is having 7% of their income go to health care.
Now, we do have on my way pre-K, so let's not pretend that we don't have that. But when you look at Mike Braun's plan specifically that he has for rural community, he talks about affordable health care and incentivizing providers so that we can close that gap, because it's not just a child care issue, it's a workforce issue and a quality of life issue.
And so what did he do for his employees when he was this wonderful employer? Did he set up child care for his employees? I don't think so.
No, but what he did is he paid a living wage so they were able to get child
living
care.
Wage. Yeah, living wage, $15 an hour is not a living wage.
And how many people does Jennifer McCormick pay?
That builds on something that Niki said, and that is how around the edges there have been these attempts to deal with licensure and registration of facilities. We haven't had yet, and I hope we don't, but some kind of tragedy where somebody that was in a facility that formerly would have not met state's licensure requirements, or because of the new age requirements, now you can have younger people in these facilities. You can have them watching more children. We haven't had it yet, but if you really want to introduce an unfortunate, tragic wrinkle into this, it would be some sort of backlash against the easing of licensure and
we do that across the board. We dumb it down rather than pay. I mean, we do it with teachers. We have teachers that they wanted to have teaching that weren't accredited. I mean, we do it all the time. You know, it's the way they're penny wise and pound foolish.
All right, moving on. Officials from Full House Resorts, which operates the Southern Indiana Rising Star Casino, made a presentation to the public in New Haven, Indiana this week, a small community just east of Fort Wayne, about moving its casino there. Rising Star Casino consistently produces the least amount of tax revenue of any gaming facility in Indiana, and Full House, which operates 7 casinos in 5 states, says it's their poorest performing casino. Full House reportedly told New Haven residents it had already identified a site for the casino. The move would be subject to state lawmakers' approval. The legislature most recently allowed a casino license in Gary to move to Terre Haute in 2019. Niki, do you think lawmakers are ready to approve something like this?
I think it's got a decent chance. You know, we interviewed both chairmen of the public policy committees in both the House and Senate. They seemed very open to it. They pointed out the distinction versus the last time we were moving casinos, that this is just one existing license from one place to another. There's no bids, there's no consolidation or expansion, and there's not a lot up in that corner that will cannibalize other. And both of them said repeatedly, look, they're gambling, but they're going to Michigan or Indiana or Ohio or Michigan, so why not have them gamble here?
Yeah,
instead?
I think the closest casino would probably be South Bend, but that's a tribal casino that I don't think state lawmakers are going to care.
I think it would be Anderson.
Would Anderson be technically a little closer? So there's maybe a little risk of that. John, the last time that they moved a casino license, the fallout from that is that somebody went to prison. Actually, a couple of people, I think, went to federal prison. Are lawmakers really ready to jump back into that?
I think there's they don't want to jump into that, but I do think, as Niki suggests, this is different. I mean, you're not having the opening it up for bid. You're not allowing other people to come to the trough and try to get their opportunity. The dollars involved here are so big, and the stakes are so high. You can understand perhaps why people are trying to cut corners or make sure that their chances are enhanced, shall we say, for success. But in this situation, I think an argument can be made, we're not doing that, we're not expanding. The E word is going to come up. Is this an expansion of gaming? Clearly, it's not. I mean, it's moving a license to an area that probably right now, there's Toledo Casino, which probably gets...
That's who you'd cannibalize from.
That's
lawmakers
probably,
here would be more than fine.
Exactly.
They'd be all right with that.
And that probably is what the casino that would suffer. So I do
want to point out one thing, though, because it would arguably, I'm sure it would make more money than Rising Sun does now, or Rising Star does now. But Rising Sun, the community where this is, would lose out on some pretty important dollars. Is that going to have to be, is making them whole or something like that going to have to be a part of the conversation if this happens?
I think that lawmakers need to look at all aspects of this and making sure that in the move or the transportation, that the community is not left without a void of not only just the dollars coming in, but the jobs.
Yep.
And so I know in Gary, there was stipulation about jobs and hiring local and things of that nature. And so maybe there could be some type of a revenue share. But I think that legislators need to circumspectly look at this and make sure they're considering all sides before making a decision.
Is the local impact going to be the biggest obstacle to making this work in the legislature?
I don't think so. It's just not a large enough locale to make a big difference.
Yeah. All right. That's Indiana Week in Review for this week. Our panel is Democrat Ann DeLaney, Republican Whitley Yates, John Schwantes of Indiana Lawmakers, and Niki Kelly of the Indiana Capital Chronicle. You can find Indiana Week in Review's podcast and episodes at wfyi.org/IWIR or on the PBS app. I'm Brandon Smith of Indiana Public Broadcasting. Join us next time, because a lot can happen in an Indiana week.
The opinions expressed are solely those of the panelists. Indiana Week in Review is a WFYI production in association with Indiana's public broadcasting stations.